Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Does it say basic pornography?
No, it says basic photography.
Okay,
Depends if you're dyslexic, maybe.
good. I've got the right one keyed up there. Here's a bunch of basic photographers explaining how cameras work out on the lawn at the Golden Circle. And one of the reasons that I included this is my admiration for these folks as photographers, but also because this is one of the best things about being in a club, is having a group of people around where you can, where you can look at the back of the camera, you can say, do this and do that, and check this out and do that, all in real time, rather than reading a manual and, the other farting around that we do when we're all by ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, there's a couple of things, sort of a housekeeping thing. I have a set of links that I will share with you if you want them later. And what they are web pages that have more in-depth explanations of some of the things that we work with. And I found this particular one that I just felt that the language on it was right. It properly explained things, but it didn't overcomplicate them. And so if you want that, you can. And also, I have for decades relied on digital photography review as my go-to. So if I want to find out about a particular camera or stuff like that, that's where I go. So I'm going to share that link with you as well. Basic photography. At this point, that is my cue to fire up the iPad here and talk about it. If you go and search for basic photography, one of the things that everyone will do is tell you where it comes from. And it comes from the Greek thoughts and graph. So photographic. So that's why it's called photography. I have no idea why they put the emphasis on the wrong syllable, but that nevertheless is how it's played out. And the reason that is critically important is that photography is drawing with light. And the reason that I always call this to people's attention is because my understanding of and enjoyment of photography changed very dramatically when I came to the realization that we do not take pictures of things, buildings, people, cars, pets, grandchildren. We take pictures of light bouncing off of things. And it might seem like a, sort of a trite alternative, but it really means a lot. When I looked at my photos before, there were problems with them. And part of the problem was I was so focused on my subject, I wasn't paying attention to the light around it. Once I learned to pay attention to the light, the intensity, the direction, and all of that coming off my subject, I got way better at capturing it. And I sometimes maybe overemphasize that part, but it is critically important. The basic concept of photography has been around since about the 5th century BCE, when an Iraqi scientist developed the camera obscura, which was a dark room with a hole punched in one wall, and the image that was adjacent to that hole or across from that hole in the wall was lit up upside down on the far wall of the room. And that was camera obscura. For a long time, people used to do this, develop camera obscura rooms, and then they would draw and paint the image that was projected on the wall. So they're sort of the first projectors. That's how that was the only thing that happened image-wise until in the 1830s in France. And 1830 wasn't that long ago. 1830 happens to be the year that my family left Ireland and moved to Canada, and we're only 3rd generation Canadian. So not that long ago, Joseph Nicephore Niepce used a portable camera obscura to expose a pewter plate coated with bitumen to light. This is the first recorded image that did not fade quickly. I don't know when it faded or how long it was or anything like that, but it was a sort of the first permanent capture of an image. And as you can appreciate, photography was only for professionals and the very wealthy people. And today, you know, it still largely is. We don't realize that we're amongst the very wealthy people that can afford cameras and time and to do all of these things, because there's lots of cultures where people don't have the resources to be photographers the way that we are. But George Eastman changed all of that when he started a company in the late 19th century and developed flexible roll film that didn't have to be always changed the way solid plates do. Solid plate, as you can appreciate, yanking a solid plate out of a camera, these would be big things, 8 by 10 generally in size, and managing those and getting them to the darkroom and all that was a whole lot of trouble compared to taking a roll of film into a darkroom and developing it. The camera that George Eastman developed had the roll of film in it, and you sent the camera back, and they opened the box up, took the film out, developed it, sent you back, I assume, the camera with a new roll of film in it and your pictures from before. So even more archaic than it was in as late as, say, the 1990s, which was the last decade that before we got digital. Once they developed 35 millimeter film and cameras for photography, became much more portable. In the 1930s, and not long after, the Polaroid process was developed and was affordable and popular in the early 60s. And of course, that was where you take a picture and it spit right out of the camera, ready to go. It had all kinds of flaws in it from an image quality point of view, but from a convenience point of view, it couldn't be beat. You could go to a party and hand out all the pictures and Bob's your uncle. At the end of the 20th century, digital cameras became widely available and were adopted, largely replacing film-based photography, although film is still available and is still supported by a significant following. In 2000, in the year 2000, I bought my first digital camera, and I think I showed that to people. What was that presentation where I showed you my Coolpix 950? And it was the first, it was the 5 and 10 thing. And that was the first digital camera that was used in photography in central Alberta for publication. The image quality wasn't good enough for the Advocate, but I ran a small community newspaper in Rimbey, and because most of our pictures were black and white and often small, we could get away with a Coolpix 950 back in 2000. And it really changed everything, almost everything for the better, some things for the worst. But I think that's the end of basic photography, blah, blah, blah. Just let me check in my notes. Yeah. The photography, as I said, is all about light bouncing off of things. And what we do when we take pictures is we control more than create, because all we really do is capture what's out there. Language is the other interesting thing, is that we used to refer to this as shooting pictures and like that. Nowadays we're called makers, and we refer to as capturing, and capturing is a whole lot closer than shooting or taking or whatever words we used before. One of the beautiful things is that modern cameras automatically measure and calculate the basic info that we need that we would normally adjust manually on the camera. I'm going to kind of back up here to the mid 80s when I was the publisher for the Students Association at Red Deer College, because my principal job there was to recruit a team of volunteers and produce a campus newspaper and a yearbook every year. One of the wonderful things about that was that it was my job to teach these people how to take pictures. And so in order to do that, I had to go out and kind of learn how to do it myself. I took some courses and that, but mostly it was the day-to-day. Some of the photographers that I worked with, the student photographers, were excellent photographers by today's standards. One of the reasons for that was they didn't have automated cameras. So we had photographers who were very good technically. I mean, they could look at the lighting that they were in and they almost knew exactly what shutter speed and aperture they were going to use and exactly how they were going to do things. And it was always reflected in their photos. And then there were other ones who were just awful that, would take pictures of people from the wrong angle and all of that stuff. But it was a really important background to have because you had to do these things and you couldn't just, grab a camera and push the button and come back with a photo. That said, that's actually what I recommend as basic photographers that you do, is that you put your camera on fully automated, let the camera work it out. You've spent thousands of dollars to have a very high-tech computer in a very small box do all of this thinking and calculating for you. And that frees you up to focus on the other things that are very important: composing your photo, determining the angle. And when we get to the example photos, this isn't all going to be just text on a screen. We'll talk about different things. About how important that is. Very often, I know that you've all experienced this, you look at a set of photos and you can tell that that photo was taken with a camera that was exactly 5 foot 6.5 inches off the ground, pointed directly at the head of another person who was 5 foot 6.5 inches tall. The reality is that moving away from that angle is the first thing that you do to improve that photo. That person probably doesn't look their absolute best straight on like that. And so if the camera is going to look after the exposure for you, you can build a checklist in your head about what you have to do. And the things you have to do is determine where the light is coming from, what its intensity is. You need to try different angles on your subject to see if you're capturing what you want. This is my own experiences coming home and looking at my photos after being out on a photo trip and looking at it and realizing, yeah, that's okay, but surely it could have been better than that. And of course it always is. The other thing is take pictures deliberately. Go out, and when you go out on a photo shoot, spend your time actually concentrating on the subjects that you're trying to capture and trying different angles. What always comes to mind for me was working the Canada Winter Games and laying on the ground for an hour and a half shooting cross-country skiing. I could have just stood there all that whole time and taken all those pictures, but you wouldn't really have seen any of the skiers' faces because they were looking down skiing. And by laying on the ground, I ended up getting all of these images of people and what they were doing that really explained how cross-country skiing works. Standing up, it would just be a bunch of people skiing by. One of the things that you'll decide early before your shoot, and it'll depend on the shoot, is what metering system to be using, to be setting your camera up with. I typically run my camera on either full segment or center weighted. Full segment means that the light strikes the light meter in the camera across some of these have like 24 or 36 segments that they do, and the computer then calculates exactly what that intensity and contrast is, and determines the exposure setting for your camera. It sets your aperture and shutter speed when you do that. Center weighted is the same thing, except it uses fewer segments of the light meter, and they are biased toward the center of the image. The assumption is that your subject is in the center, and so that the light that it gets off of the center is more accurate to your subject. Whereas multi-segment, if there's a bright object in the right side of your image, for example, that you can't compose out of the image, it will affect the exposure to the detriment of your subject, which might be in the middle of the image. And the other one is spot metering, and spot metering is something that's fairly specialized, because it uses the center of the light meter, but it's also extremely important. If you're in a situation where your subject is backlit, if you switch to spot metering and meter right off the center of their face, the background will be blown out, but that's fine. The skin tones and the person's face should be spot on. That might even be where the term spot on came from. I don't know. But I think the important thing from a basic photography point of view is that you let the camera do the work that you paid it to do. I noticed through the list of cameras that I think the oldest camera here is a 2007, which seems old, but in fact, it's still a relatively modern piece. And although, they improve them every year, it still is capable of taking really excellent images. Why is this thing not doing this? Oop. I think this photograph, I think I used this photograph because I wanted to emphasize that we take pictures of the light bouncing off of stuff. And you can tell the light is really bouncing off this church this is in Markerville, I think. And that was that. This is how recent these developments have been. In 1964, the first through the lens metering system happened. And I'll share a little anecdote with you that inspired me to be a photographer. When I was about 9 years old, my older brother, who would have been 16 at the time, went on a camping trip with his close buddy. They were a high school buddy. And when he got the photographs back, he was really excited. And the photo that he had was the two of them sitting at the table in this very rustic cabin, lit by a candle. And they each had their hunting knives stabbed into the table, and they were in a solemn pose as though they were saying grace before dinner, which was BS. They weren't grace kind of guys, but that was the photo they were taking. So he took this photograph, lit only with a candle, with a camera sitting across the room, and it was a really remarkable picture. And I was blown away. To begin with, I really admired these two guys and all this stuff, but the fact that my brother created this incredible image of the two of them doing that in a room that was essentially dark, no power anywhere, any of that stuff. And it continued to inspire me for a long time to learn how to do this, because there was something very cool about photography that I discovered as a result of that photo. It wasn't long after the development of the Pentax Spotmatic camera in '64 that they were able to automate that, so that with a Spotmatic, you would look through the viewfinder, look at the recommended aperture and shutter speed settings, set the camera up and take the picture. In 71, they automated that so that when you push the button down halfway, it did that measuring, set your exposure, you push the button the rest of the way. And it was, you know, it was like Disneyland. And then in 1980, Pentax added the first autofocus cameras. And that's, I find the same thing with photographers. Let the camera do the autofocus. There are specialized kinds of photography, macro photography and stuff like that, where you knock it into manual and do manual focusing, partially because it's a better way to do it, because a lot of autofocus systems don't work that well in that tight of an arrangement. But it's one more thing that you don't have to do, so you shouldn't. I'm gonna, yeah, do that. Lenses are extremely important. A lens can be as simple as a tiny hole drilled in a lens connection protector, because it'll do it. You can hold that up and push the button and it'll actually put an image on the sensor of your camera. But it's a stupid thing to do, so don't do it. Prime lenses are lenses of a fixed focal length, generally speaking between 1.2 and 2.8 aperture. Other people have a different definition, and the prime lens for them is just their principal lens that they work with in a given environment, regardless of what the aperture is. That said, all prime lenses are of a fixed focal length. So we hear people talk about them in the club all the time, because I think that prime lenses take some of the best pictures, and it's partly because the simplicity of the design of the lens reduces fewer anomalies like what's the word I'm looking for here? Chromatic aberrations and stuff like that. This is the rundown of the of prime lenses, lenses by focal length. Ultra wide lenses, you either use them to take shots that would typically be wide landscape and that sort of thing, or to put a different shape on the subject that you're doing. This, if you distort your subject, you sometimes get a more interesting angle or a different look, an exaggerated look that's sometimes very appealing. Anything below 12 millimeters is typically called a fisheye lens, and that may or may not be an absolute, because I think that a fisheye lens has to, you know, kind of cover off most of that half sphere to get that. Good. 24 to 35 millimeter. 35 millimeter is one of my favorite lenses. It's a little bit wider than than you might call a standard, but you'll often find that in sort of as a carry around lens, you want something that's a little bit wider than a restricted view in front of you, and it gives you the opportunity to have more flexibility in your composition. 50 millimeter is a standard lens, has been for ages, and it's popular partly because it's a similar perspective to our inherent vision. So that photographs taken with a 50 millimeter lens tend to record the subject in the way that the person who's viewing the photograph would see the subject if they were there. You've probably heard Michelle talk about her 85 millimeter prime that she uses. It's referred to here as a portrait lens, and that's very true. They're very good for portraits, but they're good for all kinds of other things too. And lots of people use 85 millimeter for for landscape and get some very interesting landscape photos out of it. When I was at the college, the camera that I used was a Pentax K1000, and it had a 90mm Tamron lens on it. I didn't know at the time that that was called a prime lens. That was just the lens and camera package that I put together to teach students. And one of the reasons we bought the K1000 was very, very simple camera and very rugged. They used to say you could pound nails with it when you weren't taking pictures. That wasn't entirely true, but it would really take a beating. And there wasn't a whole bunch of gewgaws on it to distract people or get badly set for the next person that had it. While I was learning to do this, and we were doing these yearbooks, we worked with the publishing companies, and they were very sensitive to the quality of photos that we would send them. So they came in and taught us to use gray cards. I should point out that in 1985, we were shooting almost all black and white. Later on, we added added color to our yearbooks, but the important thing was that if you didn't use a gray card, if you couldn't capture middle gray accurately, it affected your highlights and your shadows detrimentally. So you'd end up with a book with a whole bunch of low contrast photos or too contrasty photos, so they were kind of unpleasant to look at. So we used to hand out these little gray cards to people, and they had a middle gray on one side and a darker gray on the other. And then when I was on a workshop, a guy said to me, "You do understand that in black and white, a pair of medium range, medium color blue denim jeans is middle gray." So from that, I learned that if you're out in the field, you don't have to whip the gray card out of your pocket. You just lift your leg up, point the camera down, measure the light in your scene, set your camera, and away you go. That made a made a huge difference in the photos that we're taking in, because everybody started to do it, and everybody's photos really improved. Now, it's not entirely relevant today because the cameras that we use today capture middle gray very capably, and they're actually set up to do that. The K1000 was a single lens reflex, which means it has a mirror and a prism, which bounces the image around inside the camera up into the viewfinder. So you're actually looking through the lens, and you get an accurate look at what your image is going to be. If you were using like a twin lens reflex, which is the same kind of a deal, but with two lenses, or a rangefinder camera, there's good possibility your image wouldn't look. Your image when you got it back, or in the case of a digital camera, when you were working in post, wouldn't be what you saw through the viewfinder. The other two lenses that I've listed here are 135mm telephoto. Again, we talk about they're used by action and sports photographers or to capture faraway objects. But as we learned from Lee Nordby, he uses them for landscape and because he knows what he's doing, he gets very effective photos. And I suspect that a whole bunch of people who attended his presentation will start using their telephotos in the field for landscape photos as well. And then there's the above 200 to 500 and 600mm, called super telephotos. They're pretty specialized. I mean, if you want to do effective wildlife photography, you really do need to buy a really good long lens. And the lenses that they're building today are technically far superior to what was available 15 or 20 years ago. They're not necessarily as sturdily built, but I think that they perform quite a bit better. This is what a lens looks like when you pop it open. You can see that the light passes through a whole bunch of elements, through the rear element. And the reason that I put this in here is to point out that the aperture is in the middle of all of this, so that the light bouncing off of your subject goes through a whole bunch of convolutions before it even hits either the mirror or the sensor in your camera. This is that view of this thing. When you push the button down, the mirror thing here pops up, the sensor's exposed, and the mirror drops right back down again very, very quickly. But you can also see where the image comes in, hits the mirror, goes up and hits another mirror, and down and another mirror, and that's how it ends up being right side up again by the time you get to see it. This is a photograph taken with a fisheye lens, and it shows that one of the capabilities of a fisheye lens is compressing a space like this this cabin into a single image. If you were shooting it as a rectangle, you would lose out on how tall the room was. If you shot it as a pan, then you'd miss on the top and the bottom, that sort of thing. It's not a correct or accurate image, but it's very effective for what we want to do. A depth of field is something that I know that you guys know all this stuff, but depth of field is critically important, and learning to manipulate depth of field is a basic camera skill that is really something you want to learn. You want to be able to soften your background so your subject stands out better. You want to soften your foreground so it isn't competing with your subject. And the best way to do that is depth of field. Now, in order to control depth of field, of course, you have to have a lens that has a reasonable focal length, or has an adjustable focal length like a telephoto. But what you really want is to have a lens that has a good, strong, low aperture. I'm thinking 2.8 or lower. You can do this stuff when you get into the 3.5s, but it's way easier if you have that faster lens that lets you do that, because there are other ways of controlling the light going through the lens so that you can limit the amount of light and still take advantage of the much shallower depth of field that gives you that. Now, the other side of that is running a lens at almost its maximum aperture, f/22, for example, if you want to take a photograph and have the elements in the foreground and the background to also be in fairly sharp focus. And again, that's just a decision that you make when you see the photo that you're trying to take. And often what you should do in the field is take several different images of the same thing with different settings and see, have it demonstrate the impact of depth of field on the quality of the subject in your photo. This is just a snapshot I took with my smartphone, but it's a good example of depth of field. When you look at this image, the first thing you see is the condensation or droplets on the little tomato, and the other stuff doesn't compete with it because it's soft, and our eyes are automatically trained to look at the sharp parts of the photo. The time of day and light is very important. We tend to be up and around, between all of us between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, and that's when the worst light is out there, to the point that many photographers simply don't go out with their cameras during the harsh midday. There's things you can do that to deal with that. If you're in a situation where where the light is harsh and you're taking pictures of people, for example, use a fill. You can use a fill flash, which is a flash shot at a very low power, and what it'll do is it'll soften and even out the light and the skin tones on their faces. Otherwise, their faces are going to be fit with the shadows that are cast there by the sun on top of them. I chose, by the way, to use this photo because this was a very bright day, and the photo is quite underexposed, and that's because it was a metering mistake. That had I set myself up properly for this, I was shooting because I wanted to be able to stop the action, and I should have been aware of the fact that all of my photos would require a fair amount of post work on the exposures just to get them right. My favorite shooting light is cool, soft, overcast. I find that it's shadows are softened and become more transparent. Highlights are controllable. Very often with harsh sunlight, your highlights are so badly blown out that you can't rescue them in the computer when you get home. We use terms blue hour and golden hour. I know that we've talked about this at the club. I have an app for golden hour. I don't have one for blue hour yet, but the golden hour app actually takes my physical location on the planet and compares it to the axis of the planet and the position of the sun in the sky, and tells me exactly when golden hour will occur on any given day. And of course, it's twice a day because it's in the early morning and in the evening. I'll let you read that, and I'll take a drink here. There's no question that the quality of light, and I'm sure everybody here agrees, nothing compares with golden hour. It is very special light. One of the things about golden hour that people sometimes forget is that it will help you underexpose your photos. So you need to be aware that there isn't as much light as you think there is during golden hour. But again, if you're fastidious about your metering, that shouldn't be an issue. Getting a low battery signal here, just hang on. The other thing about golden hour, of course, is the warmth of the colors, which makes them really the best light to shoot human beings under. I think that's what this is going to say right now. Yeah. The directionality is an important consideration. When you determine the direction that your light is coming from, you will notice that if you're shooting off axis, you're going to have shadows and dark tones in your photo, just by definition. I didn't mention the names of any of the apps because we all use different smartphones and computers. A simple Google search and you will have whatever you need, assuming that you don't have it already. This was shot downtown during golden hour. I think it was 6-ish in the evening in mid-September. Blue hour is, of course, the hour before and after golden hour. Again, a lot more challenging to shoot. You don't have a whole lot of light, but it does also create the opportunity to use your ISO settings on your camera to much better effect. This is a blue hour photo taken at Chesinket Lake at about 9:45. and you can see that other than the remaining pink over in the clouds, everything else has a much cooler blue hue to it, hence the name blue hour. So the light comes in the lens and hits your sensor. We're going to talk a little bit more about sensors in a couple of minutes, but the ISO is what changes the sensitivity of the sensor that you have. It's a really handy tool when you're using other tools to manipulate the light. It's very handy to be able to change the ISO, get the image that you want. As long as you're staying in the 100 to 800 range, you don't really have to worry a lot about noise. Noise starts to kick in when you get to 1600, but modern cameras go to 51,000 and higher than that, because those high numbers are required to do photography like astrophotography. You can't do decent astrophotography with ISO 1600. You just, the noise, I think, will overcome all of the smaller details that make astrophotography as magical as it is. I typically leave my camera set on automatic ISO. I generally set it to not exceed 800. If I need to be higher than that, it's something that I'll probably be aware of, and I will switch it on to manual ISO and then switch it back to auto when I'm done shooting whatever that is. I do have a very brief anecdote about my daughter was called me. This was when she sort of was first starting out as a photographer, and she said, my friend has asked me to shoot her wedding, and I called you to get some advice on that. And so I said, well, my advice is don't, which offended her. She said, oh, no, I've promised. And so I said, okay. So I gave her all the advice that I could, including things like never let the wedding party start setting up poses. It will turn into a gong show, and be an absolute Nazi about setting people up. These people have a whole bunch of other things on their mind. The last thing they're thinking about is what you need as a photographer to get the bride the photos that she wants. At any rate, they sent my daughter off at 6 o'clock in the morning to take photographs of the mother of the bride getting dressed for the day, because she had to go to work before the wedding. So my daughter went over to this woman's house at 6 o'clock in the morning and went in and took pictures of her dressing in her bedroom. Well, she was shooting a 60D, and in order to get enough light to shoot, she cranked her ISO to 25,000, and she got what she thought were pretty decent photos, and she was pretty happy. And then she went home, had breakfast, farted around for a while, and then later in the day headed off to take pictures of this wedding, forgetting that she had her camera set at 25,000. Again, she was just getting started at this, shot the whole wedding at 25,000. The photos were just freaking horrendous. So I tell you this story because it is important when you change the settings on your camera that you be aware that that's what you've done, and that you don't go out on your next job with it set the way you had it for the previous one. And I'm going to deal a little bit more of that at the end of the presentation when we talk about good habits to develop. This, I think, 100 and 400 straight ahead. 800 can be a hugely beneficial setting. And like I say, if you're shooting in low light, and go to 1600, and if you can stand the noise, that's great. There are noise reduction softwares that patch things up, and they do a fairly good job. But if you need to, go higher. And I absolutely concur with this thing about ISO 50. the difference, I would challenge any of you to be able to tell the difference between ISO 50 and ISO 200 in a finished photograph, because I don't think that I could tell them apart. This photograph here was of this little bee, and it was he was inside the raspberry plants in front of my house. So the light was highly variable. When he would move, he'd move into a completely different sphere of light. And also it was a little bit breezy. So the leaves and the bee were moving around a fair amount. So I had to use a really high shutter speed to get him stopped, him or her stopped. And so I reset the ISO to 800 and got what I think is a nice little snapshot of a bee hard at work. If I had gone with the, I think even with ISO auto, it probably would have had some blur in it from either the bee or the leaf moving. So I'll let you read this slide, because I think there's nothing worse than somebody reading a slide to you. And it's important to realize that this is just another tool to use to allow you more flexibility with your aperture and shutter speed. It just kind of backs you up a couple of 3 stops on everything that you want to do. And here is examples of why you would shoot low ISO. And an important caveat too, modern cameras have stabilization in them now. So tripods are, probably not that far away from being obsolete. Once that technology moves into, the consumer level of cameras and smartphones, yeah, we're not going to need a tripod. And this is the camera sensor thing. Each of our sensors are listed here. So my camera, which is a 2008 Olympus 420, has a 4/3 sensor in it, which is just a little bigger than half the size of a full frame sensor. The APS-C, which most of you people have in your cameras, as you can see, is about 60% of the size of a full frame sensor. And then you see the smaller ones from there. Now, the sensors, of course, in smartphones are even smaller than 1/3.2. But they have, again, these powerful computers that manage to replicate what a large number of pixels looks like in a very tiny space. Any sensor questions just off the top of your head? Okay.
No, just a minute. I thought that my 80D was a 3/4 frame or whatever. It's not?
I'll just have to check my notes.
Like from your picture, it's a bigger sensor than I had thought, and I think that's a good thing if it's true.
Yeah, it's an APS-C, that ADD.
Okay, so I'd never heard that term before. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it is. So just a quick rundown. Lori has an 18 megapixel APS-C. Oh, Emily, is Emily with us?
Oh, I didn't see your name.
No, she's not here.
Tracy, who's obviously driving a Lamborghini or a Bentley, has a full frame mirrorless 20 megapixel R6, beautiful freaking camera. I wouldn't mind spending an afternoon with that. Yeah. Anybody else not know what size sensor they got in their camera?
I don't know what size sensor I have in my 60D. Probably the
60D,
little one.
60D, APS-C, 18 megapixel.
Okay.
60D is the camera that my daughter bought originally, and she very much liked it. It's a nice camera.
What about the, sorry, what about the 90D?
It has an APS-C 33 megapixel.
Oh.
So the size is the same, but the pixel capacity is higher. So the sensor has these, they don't call them pixels in the sensor, they call them photosites, and they gather data. And the data that they gather is the light intensity of that particular photosite and its color definition. So when you have millions of them, it stores all of that data. And we're going to talk about RAW in a minute, and that becomes relevant at that point.
I just mentioned for the Canon users, their nomenclature. Usually, if it's a single number like a 5D or 6D, it will be a full frame. And if it's got two, like the 60, 70, 80, 90, it will be APS-C. The exception to the rule for that would be their 7D or 7D Mark II, which was also APS-C, but it only had the one number like their full frames.
Oh, yeah. Very good.
The Nikon D300.
Nikon D300 is an APS-C sensor with 12 megapixels.
Okay.
The interesting thing about the megapixels, by the way, was the big manufacturers, Nikon and Canon, went nuts on it. Then they started getting some feedback out of the field, and that was that people were saying, this is just way too much data. I'm running out of card space. I'm running out of computer space. My images are too big. And the reality was that the camera is designed to be able to take a picture that you can reproduce, you know, at 3 by 4 feet on your wall. The reality is the photos that these people are reproducing are 8 by 10s and 12 by 14s. They don't need all of that extra stuff. And the other thing is that if once the image is in the camera and you save it as a JPEG, it slakes off a whole bunch of the resolution that you've paid for. You may not notice it so much in terms of image quality, but you pay a lot of money to have a lot of pixels. So taking the nod from both Sony and Olympus, who started limiting the number of megapixels with their sensors, they realized they didn't have to do that. And I think that what you see here is, I think that the 90D is the last of the cameras to go into the 30s for megapixels. If you need them, they're wonderful to have, but if you don't need them, they're just more baggage. And I think this is all pretty straight ahead stuff. The size determines what you see through your camera's viewfinder. Well, yeah, sort of. You don't really see very much in terms of the fine detail through your viewfinder. Anyway, you don't see that until you've got the image on your screen and you've got it up to a size where you can actually start to see things. One of the other things about pixels is that when you're editing, if you can get in the habit of working at the pixel level, you'll be a lot happier with both the quality of the images that you modify and the speed at which you do them. It's especially true when you have to go in and take things out of an image if you do that at the pixel level, you know, you can see exactly what to turn on and turn off to not have little ragged edges or little bright spots or aberrations in your finished
What do
image.
you mean by working in your pixel level?
Well, when we're looking, so we're looking at when you magnify your image so that you can see the pixels, the little squares,
Okay,
that's working at the pixel level. Often when you use masks, and especially not very good masking, you'll then have to go back and kind of clean up the edges of things. In some cases, you can blur them or smudge them a little to do that. It's much better if you just take the time to blow it up to pixel size and just go in, and you'll immediately acclimatize and you'll recognize which of the pixels is offensive and which one catches your eye when you go back to real size and you look at it and, yeah, no, that's still not right. So.
okay.
Right. So this is the other part about sensors. The smaller sensors do crop the thing now, and that actually moves me to something that I didn't have written in here, and that's digital zoom. If you're using a camera, and I don't know how relevant that is. I use 3 different kinds of cameras. I use my DSLR Olympus 420. I use an Olympus Tough camera, which is you give up a lot in image quality, but in terms of features and usability, other than it being ergonomically a disaster, you can drop it. You can shoot underwater with it. You can do all of these different things. And it has a decent zoom on it, and you can take almost anything with it, provided that you're not trying to develop a photograph that's going to go on your wall at 3 or 4 feet in size. You need a great quality of image to begin with to do those types of mounts, and that means a good camera. But the other thing about this little camera is it has a zoom lens on it, but then in addition to that, it has digital zoom. And digital zoom is just awful, because all it does is capture a small square in the center of your image and blow it up to the sensor size. So your image quality goes all to hell. Any noise that might have been in an image will be dramatically magnified, almost to the point of, I don't even know why they do it. I can't imagine where that makes a nice image and does that. But I do recognize that they do it for saleability, because if you're just going with the mechanical zoom lens on the camera, some people would say, oh yeah, I need some. I think people always have it in their head that they're going to see a deer at 150 meters, and they're going to whip this thing out and crank the tele up and just get a real nice photograph of it. Yeah, that's actually not true. You're still going to get a really tiny image of the deer, and it's not going to be real high quality by the time you get it up to an image size where it's a great wildlife photo. And of course, it makes perfect sense that the sensor size affects these things that we talk about, low light performance in particular. Full-sized sensors shoot beautifully in low light. And that's one of the biggest trade-offs to step down to either APS-C or 4/3. It's not huge in the sense that both those sensors also take terrific images, but it's just not the same as a full frame. And because full frame performs so much better, there's a whole bunch of other things that you just don't have to do. You don't have to do a lot more farting around with ISO or even shutter speed or aperture as much, simply because the sensor is performing so well. The knock on full-size sensors was for a long time that you had to have a huge camera body to accommodate them. And I thought it was very interesting. This was about 20, it was in 2010 was when the Olympus OMD series came out. And I was aware of it and was following it in the news. And as soon as it was available, I went and bought it. The first few weeks, and you know all these people because they're all part of our community. First little while where I was using it, I mean, everybody was just kind of looking down their nose a little bit at this small mirrorless camera with its small sensor. And I was blown away. This camera took the best pictures I had ever taken in my life. And what I really liked about it was it fit my hand perfectly. And it was small and light and easy to handle. Imagine my surprise 6 or 8 months later when Colin from McBain parked his Mark camera and bought an OMD for all of the shooting that he did. Now, I believe he's now back and has got one of the bigger cameras again, but it's a huge issue. If you're a photographer that likes to carry a couple bodies with you, you don't want to be carrying 2 of the big series, Nikon or Canons. They're literally a pain in the ass if you're out in the wilderness with them, and you have a pair of them to babysit. Much less hassle with a mirrorless, a smaller bodied camera. And that was the other thing I wanted to talk about was camera raw. So when this light goes through your lens and hits your sensor, the data is captured and it is either saved on your memory card as a raw file, or it's routed through the computer of the camera and saved in whichever format you've set your camera up to save, normally JPEG. So in order for it to create a JPEG, one of the things it does is it casts off a whole slew of pixels. From an image quality perspective, that's not good. You want, if you're going to do particularly very subtle white balance changes or subtle color changes, if you can do that at the raw stage where you affect every pixel, then the JPEG that you make from that modified file is much more satisfactory than the one that you had made if the camera automatically converts that. It like either doesn't create a raw file or simply converts that into a JPEG. Now, the other thing, the center paragraph here points out that the raw file is like unprocessed photographic film. Every time you load it up, you've got the same unprocessed film. You're right back to ground zero with that image. Whereas if your camera saves as a JPEG, you're really working with much less than you had when you pushed the trigger, because just the nature of the amount of data that we want to save when we do this. So camera raw is a really nice feature. It's a pain in the butt if you are using some of the proprietary photo organizers either don't recognize it, or they'll store your image but you can't see them and you have to convert them and like that. That doesn't alter the fact that that raw is critically important when you're taking great images and you want to save them. You want to save them later on in different formats from raw, or you may want to process a whole shoot of images to alter the white balance, and you just alter the white balance on all the raws and you're there.
I have a quick question about the raw file.
Okay.
So I shot monochromatic on my camera, and when I got them home, they were all in color.
Mm-hmm.
Is that normal?
I believe it is.
Okay, so would it have been if I had put JPEG, it would have automatically shot them in black and white? It would.
I'm not sure of that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that's correct. The in camera, if you set it to black and white, that's only affecting the JPEG, not the RAW.
I think you are right, Mark. I think I heard somebody actually say that here a while ago. One of our presenters. How many of you are shooting in RAW now?
Yeah, I
I
do.
am for sure.
I actually shoot in both. I do the JPEG plus RAW, and then if I'm in a hurry, then my JPEG will have to do, and if I'm not, then RAW will do it for me. I'll edit it after.
Yeah, I shoot both as well. I haven't in the last couple of years been doing so much post-processing that I needed to change white balance on images and stuff like that. But that's probably, you know, the more I'm getting into it these days, that may be the case. We're going to move ahead to composition now, and less typing on composition. These are all snapshots that I took, and I picked snapshots deliberately. When I first started putting the presentation together, I was out looking at photos to feature, and I just wasn't comfortable using photos that I didn't really know anything about. But this is an example here of a photograph. You know the scene. We're visiting my stepmother with my daughter, et cetera, et cetera. So we set the camera up to get a group photo of everybody. Pretty crappy photo. But when you crop it, it's much better. You get the ceiling fan out of there, and I could go in and take the other little part out of it and all this other stuff, but I just thought that that was an example from a composition point of view. I should have set it up like this to begin with, so I didn't have to edit it later. But that was the thing that I was saying about setting your camera up and letting it do its job, and that allows you to go and do your job as a photographer to compose this photo, in this case pulled in much tighter, and just a much better look at everybody that's there. Again, this would be a typical photograph that a person might take of this church as they walk by. This one tells us a whole lot more about the environment. We have the same information from the church, but you know, the same thing. It's just two different photographs of the same subject, where you're trying, in this case, just trying to capture more of the setting that the subject was in.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So we're talking about pixels, and this is something that I didn't ever quite understand. So if you zoom in on a picture, that doesn't do anything to the pixels, right? So you'd rather zoom in on site than crop later on at home.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
I just wanted to confirm that in my head.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, when I'm here, I mean, this photo here would stand. I can't do it. I thought I could, but no, I can't bring it up. But this photo is, if you blow it up, is still really quite tight and sharp, especially considering it was taken with a smartphone. This one here, if we took that church and blew it up the same extent, it would start to be looking soft and the colors would start to shift off. This is an important point for me. This cute little ragamuffin is obviously my grandson. This is a photograph that many adults take of children. You know, you've seen it. Again, camera is set at 5'7", shooting down on this little guy's head. The same kid, this photograph contains his environment largely as he sees it. So there's additional information in there that you wouldn't typically have. It's a crappy photo. The point is, though, if you want to take pictures of kids, get down to their level. That's when you get pictures that really express who they are, and it shows everything in proper scale. If I stand up and take this picture, it just doesn't look the same. A picture of a car. In this case, we were getting this car ready to sell. But cars, I've been a car nut my whole life. So this is a really crappy car picture. It's just, again, it's standing with my camera stuck to my face. This is a much better picture, crouched down. The car looks much better than it did. It also doesn't have that nasty shadow, but that's another matter entirely. But another thing that I could have done was just opened the door and turned the wheel slightly so that the tire was turned out, in which case the car then appears to be in action. And it makes a huge difference in the quality of the image of that car. And if you're taking a picture of a car, other than to put it on Kijiji, you probably want to capture what you believe to be the car's character. If you're taking a picture of a very expensive sports car, you need to take the time to kind of analyze its lines and make sure that you capture what the designer had in mind when he was doing that. Because if you just stand up and take a picture of it, it becomes very static and really doesn't do justice to the creativity of the designer. And that cars is one of them. That goes with pretty much everything. You take a flat picture of a guitar, an electric guitar, it's an electric guitar. You take the same picture, but shoot it from the perspective of the tuning heads down the body of the guitar, or the other way around, the body and up the neck. Very different, very dramatic change in the information that you're sharing. This is an example of a photograph where the sun set up my composition. I walked around this building until I found this spot where there was this outfacing with light reflecting off of it, and very little shadow. I have other photos of the same building because I was actually taking pictures of the building itself and not paying attention to these things. But it's an example of me recognizing that I needed the sun, the light source, to guide me in how to compose this photograph. This is a picture of orchids, and they're pretty little fangs. This picture here is a whole lot more dramatic and tells you an awful lot more about the orchid than the previous one. And it's just a question of making the decision to go all macro on it. This photo here is shooting a crowd, and I don't know if I didn't do it. I had a companion photo that went with this that I took before I crouched down. And the difference is palpable. In this case here, what I was trying to get was a candid photo of these people walking by. When I was standing up with my camera pointed at them, all of them were looking at me. When I crouched down, they were looking at where they were going and they were doing what they were doing. And you get a very natural photograph of people moving. Again, crappy photo, a woman with her eyes closed and all of those other things. But the important thing is the angle of attack here, that you might actually feel a little silly doing this. You'll be really happy with the results that you bring home. If you're taking pictures of people particularly, try a whole bunch of different angles on them, because otherwise all of your photos will end up looking just about exactly the same. Other than the humor, I'm not quite sure why I included this in our presentation tonight. It may have been, I don't know. The caption for it was, let's fly up 2 weeks early, you said, it'll be great. The ice will be all gone, you said, we'll have fun. Anyway, can you tell which one of these is the male goose?
Absolutely.
Was that taken this week?
No, it
Because
was.
I heard there's geese down at Mackenzie.
Oh, that wouldn't surprise me. They're opportunist buggers, they are. Yeah, this is a bad year. I noticed that I've got buds on a bunch of fruit plants in my yard, and I'm not happy about that because that could end up being no fruit this year for them. This is, I don't know if you recognize the tomato. I took a picture of the tomato and realized that it was completely unspectacular because you have no idea what size it is. So I decided to take a picture of it beside a telephone booth, and it turned out that that didn't help. So I got a dime out, a dirty dime, and took it. And again, I encourage, and the other part about this is the demonstration of the softening of the background with depth of field. This bouquet is called Bouquet 2020 because that's how I felt about 2020. And I think that I included it to suggest that it doesn't have to be pretty to be effective and cool to look at. This here, a real pretty little blossom on one of my plants. Anybody know what this is? But taking a picture of a flower with the skirting and the siding of your house in the background isn't that groovy. So I just slipped a piece of paper behind it and took this picture here. And I'm much happier with that, obviously. Same thing, what I'm underscoring here is the importance of thinking about your subject, taking the time to, sort of figure out what you want to do and then figuring out how to do it and giving yourself the time to do that and not just expecting these things are going to happen to you automatically. You will be rewarded for your creativity every time you do this. Again, it's not a great image, but it was a great example of this is probably a better, can't magnify. Flash. Not going to spend a ton of time on Flash, but Flash is important, and Flash is a very important tool in the photographic work that I've done. I should probably back this up and explain to you what my photographic background is. I did 10 years at Red Deer College, training volunteers and doing that. During that time, I learned how to shoot pan photos, and I got really, really, really good at it. That was when we were shooting almost exclusively in black and white and entirely on film, but I had access to a darkroom, so it wasn't a big deal. But what I learned about shooting pan photos was the absolute importance of locking the camera on your face and gently triggering the shutter. And because when you do a pan photo, you have to lock the lens on your subject as it's moving by you. You got to move at exactly the same speed. And when you do that, when you gently squeeze that shutter off, it gives you a really sharp picture of your subject. Background has a really nice motion blur to it. Things like hubcaps and tires are obviously in motion. I think one of my images won the sports category in the winter competition. That was done using a DSLR on a tripod with a long lens on it, and the lens had a number 8 neutral density filter on it. Number 8 is dark like sunglasses, like really dark, but it knocks it down so that on a bright February day, which is when the motorcycle races at Gull Lake are, you can shoot at between a 30th and a 60th of a second, which is what you have to do to get this motion blur happening. Because what I wanted to have is I didn't want to be able to see the studs or the spokes on the motorcycles. The other people that were taking pictures at this event that I saw, they were all shooting at 500th and 1,000th of a second. So the motorcycles all looked like they were getting ready to fall over, that they were just sort of stationary like a statue in the middle of the track. on mine, probably only 1 in 10 or a dozen or 20 photographs was right what I was looking for. But none of them had these, like I say, the spokes or the studs or any of that other stuff in it. I tried to do this same thing with bicycle, and the only challenge with bicycles, of course, is that the rider's legs and feet are moving. It doesn't seem to really affect the overall image. The viewer forgives that motion because it sort of supplies this additional detail that that object is moving forward. A dedicated flash is a flash that's, for example, using a Canon flash that is dedicated to that particular series of Canon cameras, ditto Nikon, ditto all of the other manufacturers. Now, there are flash manufacturers who manufacture flash attachments that work with all of these cameras, but almost always the dedicated flashes have feature tie-ins that are worth having. One of the things about flashes is that you can set them to do through the lens analysis of exposure. And that's really important. That's when you can get flash to really perform for you and not blow people out. I did a lot of event photography when I worked for the Chamber of Commerce and for Red Deer College. And in the early days, we had to use flash because the rooms were so bloody dark. And the problem was that you were blasting people in the face, because I was usually, 6, 8, 10 feet away from them when you take the picture. And even a soft flash is harsh when you're in a dark room. Also, their pupils are all really big because it's a dark room. But worst is there's a big shadow cast behind them. So in those situations, what I would do is, number one, I always had a diffuser on my flash, either the one that came with the flash. You see them, they pull out and fold over the whatever you call the front part of the flash where the light comes out. Or I used to have a thing called a Peter Fong that looked, it just looked like a little bell, a little white bell that pointed straight up, or whatever direction the flash was pointed. And you bounce the flash off of a ceiling or a wall. And what it does is it diffuses the light and also alters the direction that the light's hitting your subject from. If the subjects are people, it means that their eyes and their noses and their mouths, etc., are properly lit. They don't have shadows cast on them by the intense flash. The people don't have aren't sort of reacting to the fact that you're about to blast them in the face either, because it isn't an uncomfortable thing. So if you have the opportunity, and depending on the shoot, you can remote mount your flash and trigger it with your camera and control where the light comes from and hits your subject. It's very important to be able to do that. If you don't do that, then you have to have static lights that are on all the time that light your environment so that you can shoot in it. And sometimes you do that anyway. You have static studio lighting, and then you have a very light flash that just draws out the highlights and really enhances the quality of your snapshot. Filters are the other thing that interfere with light coming into your camera. I talked about neutral density. Neutral density is available either in graded steps that are very accurate and generally very high quality, or you can get a variable neutral density filter that you turn and dial in the amount of density that you want. One of the things about variable neutral density filters is they aren't any good at extremes. I understand that the really expensive ones are, but the ones that I had, the one that I had was $120, and it still had this aberration in it that when you hit the extreme end of it, it produced an X in the middle of your photo. And what that was is that's the intersection of the density shading in the variable filter that creates that. And the only thing you can do is back it off until it's gone. What I discovered after having this thing for a while was you back it off to where it was gone, and then you go just a little bit further, because you won't see it on the camera, but you will see it in your finished image. That said, you'll see it, but a lot of the people who look at your photos won't notice it. But that's a factor. Polarizers are very handy filters to have. Variable polarizer is my favorite. It has the same vagary in that at extremes they can get a little hinky, but they're absolutely polarizing filter on a camera in bright sunlight will turn what would be mediocre photos into really nice images. And you can do things like shoot a lake and either enhance the reflection of the mountains on the lake, or take the mountains out of the lake entirely, like cancel out that reflection just by changing the polarity on it. Now, I was driving out to the coast one time, and I was really struggling because I just couldn't believe how beautiful the scenery was going down the Coquihalla, but I was trying to get to Vancouver, you know. And finally, I had this little conversation with myself, said, you know, you better just stop the car and take some pictures, or you're going to regret this. So I pulled the car over and got out. And when I went to take the picture, I flipped my sunglasses up on my forehead, and the scene just wasn't nearly as dramatic as it was sitting in the car with polarized sunglasses on. So something to remember. The other type of filter is a lens protector. Some people call them sky filters. They're a must. If you have an expensive lens on your camera, make sure it's got a sky filter on the front of it. A couple of reasons. It will prevent your lens from getting a scratch on it. I dropped my camera unlocking my door, and it fell and landed on my concrete step. It blew the filter out of the lens entirely and bent the filter frame. The lens had a little wee scratch on the side of the barrel, and other than after I picked all the shattered glass out of it from the filter. So the filter cost me, I think, about $35, and the lens that would have cost me probably 10 times that much. It wasn't a real fancy lens, but that was the deal. And then the other thing are art filters. You can put sparkles in your stuff. You can put filters where you split your image in half, and the top half is warmed up, the bottom half is cooled off, or vice versa. A whole slew of those things that are sort of mechanical art filters. They are trumped today, of course, by the incredible array of digital filters that you have on your computer. Post-production and workflow. This is where we get to the do as I say, not as I do portion of the presentation. I still have a nightmare of 30 years of photos to sort through. And that may have to be done by my heirs if I don't start doing it fairly soon. I have a couple of times gotten in a situation where I've developed a workflow. And what that is, the way that particular workflow was when I came home, when I walked in the door, I took the batteries out of the camera and put them in the charger, took the card out of the camera and stuck it in the computer and transferred my images over to the computer. idea was is that I would then sit down, probably not right away, because normally when you come home from particularly a day of shooting, you just don't have the energy left to be doing this stuff. And you probably don't have the eyes to be making the critical decisions you want to make when you're enhancing or manipulating your images. But what you want to set up is a situation where you do it as a session. And there's some really important things to learn, to convince yourself to do if you don't already do this. Go through your photos and throw away all the stuff that's no good. If it's out of focus, punt it. If it's a picture of somebody with their eyes closed, punt it. Just get rid of it. You're never going to use that photo. And you're never going to wake up in the middle of the night saying, oh my God, I wish I'd kept that photo. Never going to happen. Throw them away. They just become so much extra stuff to cart around, even in your head when you're looking for photos. So one of my challenges today is going through my photos, not finding the ones I want, but finding the ones that I don't particularly want. The other thing I encourage everybody to do is learn how to tag your photos. Once you get into the rhythm of doing that, you'll have a set of tags that you throw on every photo, and then you'd punch in 3 or 4 more tags on that. Then when you want to find photographs of sea lions, you just type in sea lion and bing, they're all there. Or San Francisco 2015, bing, all of them are there. And that's from tagging. It's not hard to do. Once you learn how to do it, you do it quickly, and you get more and more, you get more and more creative and a lot better at it as you go along. The other thing I encourage people to do is when you go through and you find a photograph that you've produced that you really, really like, print it off, either on your own printer or send it off to your favorite photo printer and get a hard copy made of it. A couple of reasons is printed photos, you'll have a different relationship with that print than you do with an image that's got to have a laptop strapped to it for you to look at it. But the other thing is that digital photos are temporary. There's, I don't know if this is still the case, but about 15 years ago, one of the futurists pointed out that there's a very good chance that 500 years of imagery will just vanish from the planet overnight. And that's what happens when formats change and things don't get rescued. There are different, we could have an electromagnetic force event that would, if not delete, probably damage a whole bunch of the images and videos and digital material that's being stored electronically. So print your best work. Makes great gifts, if nothing else. When you create your workflow, have an endpoint. So if you sit down with a stack of 50 images from an event, have an idea of what it is that you need to get out of it. Otherwise, you're going to probably sit there and fart around with them for hours and not do anything. Once you've got what you need, save them where you want to save them, and then move on from there. Camera care, habits, organization. Take good care of your equipment. Fresh batteries. If you buy a camera, well, one of the things that you'll know if you've done the research on your camera is whether or not it has good battery economy, because if it's blown through batteries, it'll be criticized in the reviews for that. That doesn't mean that it's a bad camera. What it means is buy yourself a couple extras. If you feel like you're being held up by Nikon or Canon because they want, or Olympus or Fuji or Sony because they want so bloody much for their proprietary ones, just buy some from China. You'll get them for 12, 15 bucks a piece, and keep them on hand, charge them up. the habit that I liked to get into, I don't know that I'm there now, but I was, when I would get home, the batteries came out of the camera and went on the charger. And in the morning when I got up, they would go right back into the cameras again. But the other thing to remember, and I know this because of the TG6 tough camera that I have, it has a GPS suite in it to identify the exact locations of the photos. And for whatever reason, it doesn't actually shut off. So if the camera sits on the shelf for 3 weeks and isn't used, it'll be down, 1 or 2 segments on the battery when I fire it back up again. So if I was going out with that camera on a shoot in the morning, when I got up in the morning, I would throw it back on the charger, and so that it was completely charged when it went back in the camera and I went out the door. Take really good care of your lenses. Watch for the accidental things, fingerprint smudges on the front and especially on the back of the lens. Sometimes that happens and you don't notice it. And you also remember, when we're in the field, we're also probably got stuff like bug repellent. If you're a sunblock person, you've got crap on your fingers, and you might go a long time thinking there's something wrong with your camera, when in fact it's got a thumbprint on the back lens of on the back lens of your long lens. Always put lens caps front and back on your lenses when they're not on the camera. That keeps them clean and protected, and it's just a habit that you want to get into. The other part of this is, I've watched people, I should go back to a picture of Carmen and Sandy and Peter standing around. I've watched people changing lenses on their cameras, and I'm amazed at how many try to feel their way on with the lens while talking or looking around or doing something like that. Just the absolute worst thing you can do. Your lens connection is a very high quality and finely machined connection. And if you bang it around a lot, eventually it's just not as tight as you want it to be. The little dots on there are there for a reason. And if you get in the habit of lining them up and carefully slipping your lenses on and off the camera, you'll never have a bad lens experience. The knockoff batteries do not charge on your Canon charger. I feel your pain. You had to buy a universal charger today. My Chinese batteries came with their own charger, and so I didn't have that problem. But I know what you're saying. The Olympus charger has one extra pin on it that isn't on the Chinese one, because of course it's the same model of battery, but it's a generic version of it. There, I'm done.
What?
Oh no, they all went home.
Yeah, can you keep going? Or? Well, thanks for that, Rob. That was great.
Good. We can do more questions now.
Awesome.
So one of the questions that I have, when I started thinking about doing this, what we used to do was a basic DSLR course. And I thought it was a great idea. The challenge is that, and Scotty experienced this, his students had a really wide range of cameras. And the difference between two T models of Canon consumer cameras was enough that you'd say, well, this is how this happens. And the other person said, well, it's just not working. Well, it wasn't working because that model, which was 2 models newer, was different. Olympus did the same thing. Their menus, and they're famous for their menus and their flexibility and the fact that you can create these custom menus and do all this stuff. But the reality is, 3 or 4 years later, they've got a completely different set of menus, and it's the same model of camera. So The things that I want to know, that I wanted to keep this as basic as possible. I want to know if there's anything that you were hoping to learn tonight that we just completely missed.
Not from my perspective. I've been around cameras quite a while, so fairly knowledgeable about how they work. The composition is my biggest struggle. Flash is something that I don't use at all, so I need to learn how to use Flash. But I think that even a refresher, there's still something you can pick up from any of this stuff. So that's I was really looking forward to it, and so thanks for that.
Good.
I agree.
Well,
I've got a few things scribbled down here. So, there's a few little twigs that you definitely caught for me. I
Good.
do have a question.
yes.
So I took quite a few pictures in the summer, and I noticed that all of them seem to have the exact same dust spots or whatever on them.
Yep.
So I once I figured that out, that I'd done that, I tried to wipe both ends of my lens, and it improved somewhat. But how do you know when it's your sensor that's mucked up and not just your lens?
Well,
There's dust spots on your sensor or something.
a visual inspection of the lens and probably with some sort of magnification, you'll find either dust or a scratch or a pit on the lens. If they aren't there, then it's a really good possibility that it's your sensor. When I went to Fiji, this would have been in 2001. And I had this digital camera that I took down and shot all these pictures. And I had all these pictures that I shot of the palm trees, silhouette pictures of palm trees in the moonlight. And when I was looking at them, there were all these interesting colored stars. Well, those were actually dead pixels in my camera. And I didn't realize that. So I took it and in the dark, took a picture. And sure enough, it was a straight black rectangle with a bunch of these colored dots, and they all lined up perfectly. So in that case, this was a camera that if you were going to clean the sensor on it, it would require disassembling and manually cleaning. And that would be either not possible or not worth doing, given that, that somebody's going to probably charge you a couple $100 to strip it down and do that. The Olympus cameras that I use all have self-cleaning sensors on them. And
mine does say that when I turn it off, it says self-cleaning or something like that. But I don't know if it works. I don't know.
But it's still got that issue with it. I know one other thing I meant to talk about in workflow, and I'll do this because I'm old and I'll forget if I don't say it right now. Memory cards. Memory cards are now, even the good ones, are cheap enough that if you buy a high capacity card, there's a couple of different approaches. Buy yourself a set of cards that correspond to the kind of photos that you take. So all of your equestrian photos would be on the same card. All of your sailing photos would be on your sailing card, and like that. Takes a little bit of extra organization to make sure you don't go out to an equestrian event with your sailing card. But the other thing is that don't delete photos off your memory cards to save money. Keep all of your photos, even the ones that are out of focus and the closed eyes one, leave them on there in exactly the state they were when you took them. And you will always have an archive of all of your photographs. And you'll end up writing on them when they were from and when they were to, and guaranteed 5 years down the road, way easier to find a photograph than it is to start digging through a couple of different hard drives, one of which has failed, and all of those other things. Back in the day when compact flash first came out, the cards were so bloody expensive you couldn't do that. You had to take your pictures, erase them, and start over again. I don't recommend that people do that. I recommend you keep your cards. It's the purest form that image is ever going to be in, and it's as permanent as you can get as well.
Back to that sensor cleaning for a second.
Yes.
One thing that I've done with mine is I've taken a picture of a wall at a high, like f16 setting. And then when I put it on my computer, I've been able to see if there was dirt on that. If I know my lens is clean, if I've cleaned it, then by taking a picture of just the blank wall, I've been able to identify that too for the sensor, which are horrible to
Thanks.
clean.
One of the things about seeing dust on your sensor means you're probably taking some pretty nice photographs, because if your photos are really mediocre, you're probably not going to notice aberrations like that. But I recognize that with things like snowflakes, stuff like that, you have an opportunity to see things within that frame that shouldn't have been there.
Well, you know what's interesting when I do notice them often is when I do any ICM. So I'm moving it, and there's a little bit of blur, of course, and then there's these dots. Like,
Yeah.
what are you doing there? And I mean, it's not really obvious, but like if you are, zooming in on something to just, and you go, oh, wait a minute, what's that? So yeah, and I think it's mostly been dust on my lens. You
Yeah.
have it sitting out at the lake for a day, and insects
And
fly by or whatever, but
and it takes no time at all, because of course, we our stuff all gets sort of hydrostatic-y and pulls things off of our clothes and things that we just don't realize are there. I think it's a good habit to get into of doing a maintenance day where you go through your stuff. Now, the other thing that I didn't see on here was I'll just see if I can find that, because I thought that was a very relevant part of my presentation here. Just a minute.
Caroline has a question too with regards to SD cards, and my question for you, Caroline, is: have you been deleting pictures in camera from your SD card? So I've been listening to a podcast lately, and one of the things they've talked about extensively on various episodes of this is if you're looking at your images through your camera that you've taken on your SD card and you start deleting them, it can corrupt your card. They said not to delete any images from your card until you get home and do it on a computer.
Yeah, I've been told the same thing, that sometimes the camera can't properly read the card after you've deleted, and it'll assign the wrong number to an image, and then you won't see that image because that image has been deleted.
Yeah, that didn't help. So that wasn't the answer she was looking for, but
Well, here's my other tip, and that was try to have a camera bag that holds everything you need. Now, emphasis on need. It's in bold and capital letters, because you don't need to carry along a whole bunch of crap that you typically have. But what you do want to have is a pen, preferably one of the 40 below.
yes,
Photo Club pens. Here's my ripoff. We went down to the judging course. The guy is throwing out little mini chocolate bars to people who asked the right questions or gave him a brilliant answer or something. So during the break, I went up and I had taken 3 of my pen collection, and I gave them to him. And they're still in their packages and everything. I said, here, hand these out as prizes. They're for photographers. They will write down to 40 below. Oh, that's really exciting. And then the bugger stuck them in his pocket and went back to Toronto with them. I hope that, anyway, a lens cleaning cloth or brush, depending on what your preference is. The brush is great for dust. The cloth is great for, whatever else, mustard or Coke or coffee or something that you splash on your lens.
rum.
So you think a brush is better than a cloth for dust?
I don't. I remember going to a presentation with one of the yearbook companies, and the photographer there was a guy that really impressed me. And he said, same thing we're talking about them being static, is that if the brush is polarized differently than the camera, different than the lens, you'll hold the brush up and all the dust will come out of the brush and stick to your lens.
Oh.
And it doesn't matter how many times you do it, you still end up with more dust on the lens than not. And so his recommendation was a piece of linen. And he carried a chunk of linen with him because it was absolutely lint free and did what it was. But he also yelled at people for for my bad habit, which is to breathe on the lens to get some condensation on it. Because normally if I have a thumb or fingerprint on my lens, it's a real thumb or fingerprint. It's not some minor smudge. It takes some scrubbing to get it off. But again, if there's a sky filter on it, you're much better off than if you're wiping it off your lens. Spare connectors. If you have to connect your camera to something, make sure there's a connector in your camera bag. Nothing worse than being 50 miles from home and not being able to do whatever it was you needed to do. Extra cards and certainly Kleenex. A pair of gloves. Remember talking with Michelle about the image of the horse that she took, and she froze her hands taking this image because she was just whipping down to the neighbors and didn't have gloves with her. So my camera bag is actually, I could take all the cameras out of it and give it to somebody, and it would be a really nice gift because it's got a whole bunch of stuff in it that's really helpful. So, and things like spare batteries and spare AA's, because I don't have a camera right now that has AA's in it, but when you get out in the field, you run into people that need those things, and they do that. I think that's okay. Anything else?
I have a question about moving up to the next camera. And someone said like the red dot you can move into full frame, but the white dots you can't. Is that true? On the lenses?
I do not know.
Canon. Yeah, and so Canon have the red dots are the full frame mount, and the white dots are their APS-C mount, and the glass is closer on the APS-C, so the mount is a little different, and there's danger that the APS-C lens, so an EFS in Canon, could hit your mirror in there, so that the EFS cannot go on a full frame, whereas the full frame EF lenses can go on a 90 or 80 or whatever. Works one way, but not the other.
Yeah.
And that kind of triggers my McBain ad that I do, that we have a pool of talent at McBain that either already know the answers to every one of our questions, or they can go and find them out. And I've always found everybody that I worked with there to be really fair. Sometimes when you go into a store, you know that the person is selling you the product that has the best margin in it for them. And I don't blame them for that. But I know that if I go and ask Hank for his opinion of something. So for example, I bought this Olympus 420, and I bought it from a couple in Calgary for $165. It had almost no shutter count on it at all. And when I got down and met them, they were a Japanese couple, and they bought this camera in Japan. So I was really excited, blah, 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 do this whole thing. Well, it had with 2 kit lenses with it. They're a little on the soft side, soft and slow. The camera has a fairly soft sensor in it already. So I went down and said to Hank, what do you have? And he said, well, I just happen to have an 18-180 here that used that would actually be a real nice walk around lens. And he's absolutely correct. The extremes of it, the 18 and 180, it's got the issues that you expect at those extremes, soft on the sides and like that. But in the middle, it's a really sweet lens. And from 18 to 180, is a really widespread for a walk around lens, and it's
Yeah.
still quite compact. I don't know that that I would have had the same experience in another camera store where a person would say, well, why don't we look at our used stuff? I think they all would have been focused on moving their new material. So I recommend that people develop relationships with the people at McBain's. I also recommend that you do not buy a camera off of Amazon or BH Photo. Nothing wrong with these companies, except they don't have people working in Red Deer. And you don't save any money generally. If you do save money, it's not of any real consequence. And I've been dealing with McBain's now for 40 some years, and they've always been really good to me. I've always found their prices are a little bit higher than what I experience other things, especially on the off-brand stuff. But I faithfully take all my business to them because they're a really important resource, and it's that kind of resource that we will lose in our communities the more we ship things in. So it's just they're great people to get information out of.
They will price match too if needed.
Oh, good.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they've price matched for me before, so I've been able to buy from them.
Me too.
Is that like price match to local stores?
Well, like it was online, it was a price online,
Wow.
and they had to look it up and check it, but it was there, and so they gave it to me at that.
Wow.
Yeah, like the camera store in Calgary, and if they've got a price that's better than McBain, then McBain will match that price.
Okay.
Carol Ann, what was your even with the adapter question about?
I think she was talking about if you have an
Sorry, you might
adapter
get
for-
some interference here with noise in the background, but there's an adapter that you can put between the camera and the lens to go back and forth between the EF and the. what's the
Oh,
other-
yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so does that get away from the problem of it hitting your mirror?
Interesting question.
It should, because it's pulling the adapter will be pulling the lens away from the body, so it's not going to make contact.
Okay.
I'm
And I
worried
guess-
about adapters only for the f-stop factor. Like it could add, 1 or a half f-stop up, but it depending on your lens.
Yes.
Oh. Well, I guess if you're going to mirrorless, then there's no mirror to worry about.
Then I've robbed a bank.
Yeah, oh, that too. No, I have a new alternator instead
Oh,
Nice.
and fuel pump. So there went that money. I can't even
happens.
see those, but
I'm using an adapter and using an EFS lens on my full frame camera now, and it works well.
It works well.
Yeah, but it's a mirrorless too, so there's no mirror to hit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
good to know.
So EFS lenses work on a mirrorless, you're saying?
Yeah, I have the
Yes.
adapter so I can use the EF lenses on the arm mount.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I assumed you had to get all new lenses if you switched to mirrorless.
Yeah.
No, I'm
If-
still using old
Yeah.
lenses.
If you rob a bank, Jenny, then you could buy all the new R lenses. Otherwise, you could get an adapter and use your old lenses.
Oh yeah, I'm not in
lenses.
the market yet, but I'm just down the road. That's interesting to know for sure. I
Yeah.
won't be robbing any banks, so.
I think I am the one who has the oldest camera. Is that correct, Rob?
I'll just verify that for you.
there's a prize for that, isn't there?
I'm pretty sure there is.
Does it run on film?
No.
Lori Gillan, 2010.
See, it might be.
Oh,
mine.
I'm not. Oh, that
No,
surprises
no,
me.
the oldest one is Helen Dobson's Nikon D300.
Yeah. Whoa.
Oh.
Oh.
I win. What do I win? A new camera?
And she has amazing
Yes, a new
pictures with it.
camera.
I
It
know,
has
it
bu-
doesn't matter about the equipment, I don't think.
It
No.
has bias ply tires and no seat belts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not ready to give up this camera yet. It was my dad's, and so it's very
Aw.
sentimental. It works, right? So
That's
I
the important
just
part.
bought a new lens, but I said to her, okay, so what's the newest camera? You know, what kind of thing would I be looking at for a camera? And we were talking about the adapters and that, because I thought, I don't want to buy a lens that I'm not going to be able to use on a new camera when eventually I do get one. So,
Right.
yeah.
That's why I stayed in this format for I went from a Rebel to the 80D, and
Yeah.
it was kind of about the lenses
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I've got
and the
three-
weight. I didn't want to carry a full frame camera, so.
Okay.
That was
That's
the
right.
the factor for me was that it fit my hand the way it felt. When I was working in Rimby, I had a Pentax film camera that was same body style as DSLRs are, and I put a sports grip on it so that it straps onto the back of your hand.
Yeah.
After about 6 months, I had, it wasn't carpal tunnel, but I had that sort of a thing. I had something really wrong with my right hand. You know what? All cameras are right-handed.
Mhm.
When you can't use your right hand, you are gibbled when it comes to taking pictures. So that's something to bear in mind as well. I have to take my leave.
Okay, well,
Well, thank
thanks
you.
again.
You
Thank
bet.
you
Yes,
very
That
thank
was
you
great,
very
Rob.
much,
Thanks a
Rob.
lot.
Okay, and like I said, I have recorded this, so I'll get a link out to everybody for sure tomorrow. Then I'll work on recording, and then I can put it in Dropbox or something too, so that you can have a physical copy of it too.
All
Great.
right. Okay. Thank you.
And
Okay,
any questions,
guys.
just fire them off by email.
okay.
Thanks, folks.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Night.